An elderly woman rescued a dying German Shepherd during a historic blizzard in Aspen, Colorado. While everyone else ignored the dog, she stopped and risked her life for him. What began as a simple act of compassion ignited a legal battle that shook the entire community, revealing scars of abuse and an illegal breeding scheme. A story of bravery, second chances, and unconditional love that will change your perspective forever. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and tell us where you're watching from. The sun barely peeked over the snow-capped peaks of the San Juan Mountains when Jake opened his eyes that winter morning. The small, isolated log cabin high in the Colorado Rockies creaked under the intense cold that dominated the region. Through the fogged window, the sky displayed an almost painfully intense blue, promising another day of frigid temperatures and biting wind. With automatic and precise movements, honed from 3 years of living alone in the refuge, he prepared his coffee and sat at the small, rustic table, observing the vast expanse of pine forest stretching before him. His deep brown eyes, like the moist earth of the mountains, reflected the stillness of the place, but also a certain emptiness that even the imposing beauty of the landscape couldn't fill. Jake had chosen this isolation after his career as a nature photographer crumbled. Not for lack of talent, his photographs had won awards and been exhibited in major galleries in Denver and Santa Fe, but because of a growing feeling that his images had lost their soul, as if technique had stifled the passion that had led him to pick up a camera for the first time. Now at 42, his calloused hands from the daily work of maintaining the cabin and cultivating a small garden seemed to belong to someone else. He hadn't touched the professional camera, stored in a box under the bed, in over a year. His cell phone, when it worked on the mountain's precarious network, was used only for sporadic contact with his sister in Durango, the only person who still insisted on keeping in touch. That morning, however, something felt different. Jake felt an inexplicable urge to walk further than usual. He layered on several clothes, put on his worn waterproof boots, and packed a backpack with water and some food. Before leaving, he looked at the stored camera and, in an impulsive gesture he didn't understand himself, took it out of the box and put it in his backpack along with 2 lenses. The cold bit his face as he opened the door. The snow had stopped falling during the night, leaving a pristine white carpet covering everything. His breath formed clouds of vapor as he walked away from the cabin, following a trail he had rarely traveled. As he ventured through the silent forest, Jake sensed something calling him in a specific direction. It wasn't a voice or a sound, but a kind of pull that made him choose certain paths over others. The feeling was so strong that he decided to trust his instinct and press on, despite the strangeness of the situation. After 2 hours of walking, when he was considering turning back, Jake reached a clearing he had never seen before. There, the snow seemed whiter, the sky bluer, and a small, partially frozen stream meandered between the rocks, creating a crystalline melody that broke the absolute silence of the place. That's when he saw her. A subtly out-of-place movement caught his attention. Among the trees at the opposite edge of the clearing, a pair of eyes watched him. Alert, intelligent, golden amber eyes that reflected the sunlight like crystals. Jake stood motionless, unable to look away from that presence. Slowly, the animal emerged from the shadows. It was a lone wolf with thick fur in shades of gray and silver, contrasting with the white of the snow. Something about her seemed unusual, perhaps the way she moved, cautious but fearless, or the way her eyes never left Jake's, as if she wanted to communicate something. For minutes that seemed like an eternity. Man and animal observed each other across the clearing. Jake felt no fear, only a strange connection, as if this encounter had been predestined. Without thinking, driven by an almost forgotten impulse, he slowly took the camera out of his backpack. The animal didn't flee. She remained there, majestic against the backdrop of snow and tall trees, while Jake adjusted the settings and began to photograph. For the first time in years, he felt enthusiasm welling up inside him, that spark of passion that had fueled his career. Each click of the shutter seemed to reconnect him with a part of himself he thought was lost. When he finally lowered the camera, Jake noticed that the wolf had approached a few steps. She continued to watch him intently, as if assessing his soul. Then, as silently as she had appeared, she turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving only her tracks in the snow as proof that the encounter had really happened. Jake remained motionless for a long time, absorbing the magnitude of the moment. There was something about that encounter he couldn't explain, but it resonated deeply within him, as if those amber eyes had seen beyond his self-imposed loneliness, beyond the layers of disillusionment he had built around himself. Returning to the cabin, with twilight painting the sky pink and orange, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: anticipation for tomorrow. The encounter with the wolf had planted a seed within him, bringing back a feeling he had forgotten: curiosity. That night, for the first time in years, Jake connected his camera to his old laptop and examined the photographs he had taken. The image of the wolf was impressive, almost mystical in its clarity and composition. There was something in the animal's eyes that both disturbed and fascinated him: an intelligence, a wisdom that seemed to transcend the natural world. He fell asleep with the laptop still open on the bed, the image of the wolf glowing on the screen like a beacon in the darkness of his reclusive life. And in his dreams, Jake ran through the snow-covered forest, following a silvery silhouette that guided him to an unknown place, but one that somehow felt like home. The next morning, Jake woke up before dawn, unusual behavior for him in recent years. Sitting on the cabin's porch, wrapped in his thickest jacket and with a steaming mug of coffee in his hands, he watched the horizon gain color as he awaited the first rays of the sun. The image of the wolf remained vivid in his mind, questioning all the patterns of animal behavior Jake knew from his years photographing wildlife. Wolves are naturally elusive, especially solitary ones, and rarely allow themselves to be observed so closely by humans. There was something peculiar about that encounter, something that defied explanation. Determined to find the animal again, Jake prepared for another expedition. This time, in addition to the camera, he took a small notebook and a map of the region, where he marked the approximate location of the previous day's clearing. He also included in his backpack a small package of jerky, not as bait but as a gesture of goodwill, in case he was lucky enough to have another encounter. The morning was even colder than the previous one, with a fine fog hanging over the forest, giving the scene an ethereal appearance. Jake followed the same path as the day before, paying attention to every detail of the terrain, every movement in the shadows between the trees, every sound that broke the dominant silence. Upon reaching the clearing, he found it empty. The stream continued its icy song, and the snow showed only small tracks of smaller animals, squirrels and hares that had passed by during the night. No sign of the wolf. Jake felt a pang of disappointment, but decided to wait. He found a place to sit, partially sheltered by a large pine tree, and prepared for a long vigil. Hours passed. The sun rose fully in the sky, illuminating the clearing with a crystalline light that made the snow sparkle like diamonds. Jake took some photographs of the landscape, rediscovering angles and compositions he had long forgotten. He was so engrossed in his work that he barely noticed when a subtle movement altered the light pattern at the edge of the clearing. This time it wasn't just the wolf. Beside her, almost hidden by the dense vegetation, was a pup, a small wolf no more than a few months old, its fur darker than its mother's, but with the same inquisitive amber eyes. Jake stood motionless, barely breathing, as he watched the extraordinary scene. The presence of the pup partially explained the wolf's unusual behavior. Females with pups tend to be extremely protective and avoid contact with humans at all costs. The fact that she had shown herself to him and now brought her pup was unprecedented in Jake's experience as a nature observer. With slow, deliberate movements, he raised his camera and began photographing the duo. The pup, curiously, seemed more interested than apprehensive, even taking a few steps toward Jake before a low growl from the mother made it recoil. The wolf kept her eyes fixed on Jake, not with menace, but with a kind of calculated assessment. That's when Jake noticed something strange on the pup's front paw. The little wolf was limping slightly, favoring 3 legs while keeping the 4th slightly raised from the ground. Even from a distance, Jake could see a swelling in the limb, possibly the result of an injury or a fall. This brought a new perspective to the encounter. Was the wolf somehow seeking help? The idea seemed absurd, contrary to everything Jake knew about animal behavior, but the whole situation was already extraordinary enough for him to consider all possibilities. Slowly, Jake opened his backpack and took out the package of jerky. With deliberately visible gestures, he placed small pieces in the snow a few meters from his position. Then he stepped back a few paces and waited, speaking in a low, calm voice. "It's all right, I'm here to help if you'll let me." The wolf watched for long minutes, motionless as a silver statue. Finally, to Jake's surprise, she moved forward, cautiously approaching the pieces of jerky. After sniffing carefully, she took a piece and carried it to the pup, leaving it in front of it as if to show that it was safe. The little wolf devoured the offering greedily, while the mother returned to take more pieces. This dance continued for a few minutes, the wolf bringing food to the pup, never eating herself, always keeping a watchful eye on Jake. The trust shown was surprising and moving. Jake was paralyzed by reverence at the moment, by the honor of witnessing such behavior. When the jerky ran out, the wolf approached Jake closer than she ever had before. Only 10 meters away, she sat in the snow and watched him intently. The pup remained further back, still chewing on the last piece of jerky. It was as if she were waiting for something, as if she had a specific purpose for this encounter. "What do you want to show me?" Jake murmured, more to himself than to the animal. As if answering his question, the wolf stood up and walked a few steps toward the forest, then stopped and looked back, directly at Jake. She repeated the movement a second time, more emphatically. "Do you want me to follow you?" The wolf continued to look, waiting. The pup had approached her, and now both were watching Jake with palpable expectation. The situation was surreal, defying any logic, but Jake felt he had no choice but to trust this strange communication. Picking up his backpack and camera, he began to follow the two wolves into the forest. They kept a safe distance, but constantly looked back to make sure Jake was still following them. The trail became steeper and more difficult, venturing into parts of the forest that Jake had never explored before. After about half an hour of walking, they reached an area where large rocks emerged from the snow like ancient sentinels. Between two of these rock formations, partially hidden by fallen trees and dense vegetation, was a small opening, a natural cave that opened into the mountain's depths. The wolf stopped at the entrance and looked at Jake, then at the cave, then back at him. The meaning was clear, even without words. She wanted him to enter. The pup had already disappeared into the dark interior. Jake hesitated. Entering an unknown cave, following two wild predators, didn't seem like the wisest decision. But something within him, the same intuition that had guided him so far, said that this was the path to follow. This was the mysterious situation that had broken the monotony of his reclusive life, and he needed to see where it led. With the flashlight on his cell phone illuminating the way, Jake entered the cave. The first few meters were narrow and low, forcing him to crouch, but soon the space opened into a larger chamber. The light from his flashlight revealed something that made his heart race. At the back of the chamber, lying on a makeshift bed of dry leaves, was a third wolf. This one was visibly older, its once silvery fur now mixed with white threads of age. One of its flanks had an extensive wound, partially healed but still clearly painful. The animal slightly raised its head when Jake entered, but showed no fear or aggression, only a resigned acceptance of his presence. Jake immediately understood. This was the wolf's mate, injured and weakened, unable to hunt or move around. She was caring for him and the pup simultaneously, an almost impossible task in the harsh mountain winter. And now, for some reason that defied comprehension, she had decided to trust Jake enough to reveal her most secret and vulnerable refuge. "You need help," Jake murmured, cautiously approaching the injured wolf. "And somehow you knew I could provide it." The wolf positioned herself between Jake and her mate, not threateningly, but as if to say, "Careful, he's fragile." The pup huddled next to its father, gently licking its muzzle in a gesture of comfort. Jake sat on the cave floor, keeping a respectful distance. He spoke softly, continuously, explaining his intentions while slowly opening his backpack and taking out the first aid kit he always carried on his expeditions. It wasn't proper veterinary equipment, but it would have to do. "I'll need to go back to the cabin for more supplies," he explained, knowing that the words themselves meant nothing to the animals, but hoping that his calm tone would convey his peaceful intentions. "But first, let's see what I can do now." Slowly, under the watchful gaze of the wolf, Jake began to examine the older wolf's wound. It was a deep cut, possibly caused by a fall on the sharp rocks of the mountain. The wound had begun to heal naturally, but signs of infection were visible at the reddened edges. Jake worked as carefully as possible, cleaning the wound with antiseptic and applying antibiotic ointment from his kit. The injured wolf shivered occasionally, but remained remarkably cooperative, as if understanding that this strange procedure was for its own good. While working, Jake couldn't help but reflect on the extraordinary nature of the events. In his entire career as a wildlife photographer, He had never witnessed such a level of trust and interspecies communication. It was as if these wolves had consciously chosen to seek his help, as if there was an understanding beyond the natural barriers that normally separated humans and wild animals. When he finished the initial treatment, Jake gathered his belongings and prepared to leave. "I'll be back tomorrow," he promised, looking directly at the wolf, "with more supplies and something better for you to eat." As if understanding, the wolf slightly tilted her head. Jake noticed that the pup had fallen asleep, huddled against its father's uninjured flank. The scene was of such deep family intimacy that Jake felt a lump in his throat. Leaving the cave, he carefully marked its location on his map and took reference photographs of the surroundings to ensure he could find it again. The sun was already beginning to set when he started the walk back to the cabin, his mind buzzing with what he had discovered. That night, sitting at the table in his solitary cabin with a glass of tequila for company, Jake reviewed the day's photographs. The images of the three wolves together in the cave had an almost mythical quality, the limited light creating dramatic shadows that emphasized the vulnerability and, at the same time, the dignity of the animals. But beyond the beauty of the images, something else was happening within Jake, a sense of purpose that had long been dormant. These wolves, for some inexplicable reason, had chosen to trust him. They had crossed the barrier between wild and domesticated to seek help, and in this process they were inadvertently helping Jake too, rescuing him from his own self-imposed isolation, reconnecting him with the passion that had defined his previous life. Before going to sleep, Jake sent a message to his sister in Durango. "I discovered something extraordinary in the mountains. I think I found a new purpose here. I'll tell you more soon." It was the first spontaneous message he had sent her in over a year. As sleep enveloped him, Jake smiled at the wooden ceiling of his cabin. Tomorrow would be a new day, a day with meaning, with challenge, with purpose, a day to follow the tracks in the snow and see where they led. Dawn brought with it a change in the weather. Heavy clouds had gathered overnight, promising more snow and possibly a storm. Jake watched the gray sky with concern as he prepared a larger backpack with supplies for the wolves. Fresh meat he kept in his freezer for special occasions, more first aid materials, old blankets that could serve as a more comfortable bed for the injured wolf, and a small pot to melt snow if necessary to clean wounds. The prospect of a storm made the expedition more risky, but also more urgent. If the weather worsened significantly, the wolves would be isolated without adequate food, and the injured wolf's condition could deteriorate rapidly. As he walked the now familiar path to the cave, Jake noticed fresh tracks in the snow that didn't belong to the wolves. They were larger, heavier, with distinct claw marks. Bear, probably. The region was home to some grizzly bears, although sightings were rare. The presence of such a powerful predator nearby partially explained the older wolf's injury, perhaps a territorial encounter that had ended badly for both parties. The discovery made him even more alert. Bears normally hibernate during the winter, but it wasn't unusual for some specimens to remain active, especially if they hadn't accumulated enough fat before the arrival of the cold. A hungry and potentially injured bear would be extremely dangerous. When Jake reached the clearing that marked the beginning of the trail to the cave, he found it occupied. The wolf was there, but not alone. Beside her, to Jake's surprise, was a man, tall and thin, with a grizzled beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in months. The stranger wore professional mountaineering clothes and carried a backpack similar to Jake's. Beside him, on the ground, was a box that appeared to contain medical equipment. The man was calmly conversing with the wolf, who surprisingly seemed completely at ease with his presence. Jake hesitated at the edge of the clearing, unsure of how to proceed. The stranger noticed his presence almost immediately, turning in his direction with a surprisingly warm smile. "Ah, you must be Jake," he called out, his voice hoarse but friendly, echoing in the clearing. "I was expecting to meet you. Aurora told me you've been helping." Jake approached cautiously, confused about several things simultaneously: how this stranger knew his name, who Aurora was, and how he seemed so familiar with the wolf. "Who are you?" he asked directly, stopping a few meters away, his posture revealing a mix of curiosity and defensiveness. "Forgive the lack of proper introductions. I'm Miguel Cervantes, a biologist and researcher with the Sierra Sentinels Project." The man extended a calloused hand. "And this is Aurora, though you two already know each other." Jake shook the offered hand, his gaze alternating between the man and the wolf, who watched the interaction with those same penetrating amber eyes. Aurora? Yes. I gave her that name about 3 years ago, when we started monitoring this family of Mexican wolves. She has a unique coloration, doesn't she? Especially at dawn when her fur seems to ignite. Jake blinked several times, processing the information. Mexican wolves, but they're not different? Miguel smiled, sensing the confusion. Yes and no. Typical Mexican wolves have distinctive characteristics, but these mountains are home to a rare subspecies with specific adaptations for the high-altitude climate. Thicker fur in more silvery tones, more compact body. Very few known specimens. That's why the project is here. Jake looked again at the wolf Aurora with new eyes. This explained why she seemed simultaneously familiar and strange in his first observations. She wasn't an ordinary wolf, but a rare subspecies of Mexican wolf with unique adaptations to the mountainous environment, making her different from typical specimens found in other regions of the country. How did you know my name? Jake asked, still processing all the information. Miguel pointed to the camera hanging around Jake's neck. I recognized your style in the photographs. Jake Miller, the famous wildlife photographer who disappeared from professional circles a few years ago. Your jaguar images in the Everglades are still a reference in our field. I never imagined finding you here, living like a hermit in the mountains. Jake felt uncomfortable with the recognition. His past fame was precisely one of the things he had fled by isolating himself in the mountains. Ex-photographer, he corrected dryly. And how do you know I've been helping Aurora and her family? Miguel smiled, kneeling to gently stroke the wolf's head, which accepted the gesture with surprising docility. That's the most extraordinary part. I've been tracking this family for weeks, ever since we noticed that Plata, the alpha male, had been injured. We lost contact for a few days during the last blizzard. When I finally managed to locate the cave yesterday, I found your bandages on Plata and your signature on the first aid kit you left there. You're monitoring them. How? Minimally invasive subcutaneous trackers, placed about a year ago when we briefly captured each member of the group for health exams. The devices are small and biocompatible with a long-lasting battery. They allow us to follow their movements and some basic vital signs without interfering with their natural behavior. Jake processed the information, feeling simultaneously relieved to know that the wolves were being cared for by professionals and slightly disappointed to discover that his magical encounter had such a prosaic explanation. So they're used to humans. That explains why Aurora sought me out. Miguel raised his eyebrows, genuinely surprised. Actually, no. We maintain the minimum possible contact. Observation from a distance, mainly. I'm the only person on the team they tolerate nearby, and even then only occasionally. Aurora's behavior towards you is unprecedented, to say the least. Aurora, as if to confirm the statement, approached Jake and briefly rubbed her body against his leg, a gesture of familiarity that made Miguel's eyes widen. Extraordinary, the biologist murmured. She trusts you completely. Jake felt warmth spread through his chest at the wolf's gesture. There was something special about the connection they had formed, something that transcended scientific explanations. So the pup, does he have a name too? Yes, we call him Spot. He's their first pup to survive beyond the first few months. Winter is particularly harsh for pups of this species. Jake remembered the little wolf limping. He's injured too. Yes, a small fracture in his right front paw. It probably happened when he slipped in a rocky area. That's why I brought more suitable medical equipment today. Miguel indicated the box beside him. I was about to head to the cave when you arrived. Can I come with you? Sure, Miguel smiled. In fact, I'd appreciate the help. And I'm sure Aurora would be happy to have both of us taking care of her family. As if understanding the conversation, the wolf began walking toward the trail leading to the cave, looking back occasionally to check if the two men were following her. Along the way, Jake and Miguel talked, exchanging information about their respective experiences with wildlife. Jake discovered that the Sierra Sentinels project was a conservation initiative focused on endemic species of the northern Colorado mountains, especially those threatened by increasing human pressure and climate change. The subspecies that Aurora and Plata represent may have fewer than 50 individuals left in the wild, Miguel explained, as they carefully walked along the steep trail. Each family is precious to the survival of the species. And what happened to Plata? How did he get so badly injured? Miguel's face darkened slightly. We believe it was an accident during a storm. We found evidence of a landslide nearby during our initial searches. Plata has a deep wound on his side, in addition to cuts he probably sustained when he got trapped between rocks. Jake felt a wave of concern. Even in protected areas, natural challenges remained a constant threat to vulnerable species. Do you have enough resources to monitor the entire area? Unfortunately not, Miguel gestured vaguely with his hand. The budget is limited. Our teams can't cover the entire extent of the reserve. That's why every collaboration counts, and your help has been invaluable. When they finally reached the cave, Aurora entered first, as if announcing the group's arrival. Miguel took out a more powerful flashlight than Jake's cell phone, illuminating the interior of the cavern better. Plata was awake, his eyes bright in the darkness. Spot the pup was resting beside him, but immediately got up upon seeing Miguel and Jake, limping toward them with youthful enthusiasm. He's improved, Jake observed. Yesterday he could barely put weight on that paw. Young ones recover quickly. Miguel smiled as he knelt to examine the pup, but he still needs attention. The fracture isn't serious, but it needs to be immobilized properly to heal well. For the next hour, the two men worked together. Miguel, with his veterinary experience, led the treatment of Plata and Spot, while Jake assisted and documented the process with his camera. The trust the animals showed was astonishing. Even when the procedures had to be painful, they remained surprisingly cooperative. I've never seen anything like it, Miguel confessed as he bandaged Spot's paw with lightweight but strong materials. I've worked with wild wolves for 15 years, and I've never witnessed this level of trust, especially with a stranger like you, without specific wildlife handling training. Aurora remained vigilant throughout the process, watching every movement carefully, but without interfering. Occasionally, she would approach to smell the bandages or medications, as if assessing their safety. Do you think they understand that we're helping them? Jake asked as they arranged the blankets he had brought, creating a more comfortable nest for the family. Miguel considered the question seriously. Wolves are incredibly intelligent with cognitive and emotional abilities that we're only beginning to understand scientifically. I wouldn't call it human understanding, but they definitely perceive our intentions in some way. When they finished, Miguel took some pieces of fresh meat from his backpack and offered them to the family. This should help them for a day or two. We don't normally feed the animals we study, but this is an exceptional situation. As they watched the wolves eat, Miguel continued. The project has a cabin about 3 miles from here, following the riverbed south. It's our base of operations. We have better supplies there, proper veterinary medications, communication equipment. You should come with me when we're finished here. Jake was surprised. He hadn't imagined that another human settlement existed so close to his cabin. How long have you been here? Almost 4 years. We're a small team, usually 3 people rotating through seasons. Currently, I'm the only one at the station. My colleagues returned to Durango for the holidays and will be back in 2 weeks. Miguel looked at him curiously. And you? How long have you been in these mountains? 3 years, Jake replied, feeling strangely like he was confessing something. Since I quit professional photography. May I ask why? Jake was silent for a moment, watching Aurora carefully grooming her mate. I lost the connection, he finally said. With what I was photographing, with what I was trying to capture. I started to feel like I was only producing technically perfect but empty images. Miguel nodded, understanding. Nature has a way of reminding us what really matters. Sometimes we need to get away from everything to rediscover it. When they finally prepared to leave, Aurora approached Jake, pressing her head against his hand in a gesture that seemed both grateful and farewell. We'll be back tomorrow, Jake promised, gently stroking the silvery fur. The way to the project cabin was revealing. Miguel shared details about the conservation initiative, the various species they monitored besides wolves, bears, cougars, eagles, and the challenges they faced. From lack of funding to the increasing pressure of tourist development in the surrounding areas. It gets harder every year, he explained, as they descended a steep trail. The authorities promise protection, but economic interests always seem to prevail. Not to mention climate change, which is altering the migration and reproduction patterns we've observed for decades. The project cabin turned out to be larger and better equipped than Jake's. Built with sturdy logs and powered by solar panels, it had a small veterinary clinic, weather station, and satellite communication equipment. The walls were covered with detailed maps of the region, with colorful markers indicating the territories of different species and points of interest for research. Impressive, Jake admitted, as Miguel poured him a freshly brewed coffee. I had no idea all this existed so close, and we didn't know we had a neighbor, Miguel smiled, much less one with your experience and sensitivity. Your help could be invaluable to the project, Jake. My help? We need to document these wolves, their behavior, their unique adaptation to this ecosystem. Your photographs could be crucial not only for our scientific records, but also for raising public awareness about the importance of protecting this subspecies. Miguel paused, assessing Jake's reaction. I'm not asking you to return to public life or abandon your solitude, just to consider collaborating occasionally, on your own terms. Jake looked out the window toward the snow-capped mountains that stretched majestically under the gray sky. For the first time in 3 years, he felt something thawing inside him, like the stream under the winter ice. I'll think about it, he finally replied. That night, as he returned to his own cabin carrying additional supplies that Miguel had given him for the wolves, Jake stopped several times to photograph the winter landscape. They weren't simply technical shots. He was trying to capture something deeper. The serene beauty of the snow-covered forest, the resilience of life in extreme conditions, the silence that spoke volumes. Reviewing the images on his laptop, he noticed something that had been absent from his work for years. Soul. The photographs conveyed emotion, connection, purpose, as if his encounter with Aurora and her family had reactivated something fundamental in his artistic perception. Before going to sleep, he wrote a long email to his sister, telling her about the wolves, about Miguel and the project, about how he felt something important was beginning to happen in his life. Maybe, he wrote at the end, isolation wasn't really what I needed, but finding the right connection. The following days established a routine Jake could never have imagined a few weeks earlier. Each morning, after an early breakfast, he set out for the wolves' cave, frequently meeting Miguel at the clearing. Together they cared for Plata, whose recovery was progressing slowly but steadily, and Spot, whose paw showed remarkable signs of improvement. Aurora began to accompany them on their trips when they left the cave, behaving almost like a guide, showing them specific places in her territory. Miguel meticulously documented each site, taking occasional samples of hair, droppings, or prey remains for later analysis. Jake, for his part, photographed tirelessly, rediscovering his passion with each shot. One afternoon, while following Aurora along a particularly steep trail, the wolf stopped abruptly, her posture alerting both men that something unusual was happening. "What's wrong?" Jake murmured, instinctively lowering his voice. Miguel also tensed, his hand slowly moving toward the bear repellent spray he always carried on his belt. "I'm not sure. I've never seen her behave like this." Aurora looked at them, then turned her attention to a specific point among the trees, emitting a soft whimper that sounded almost like a question. After a few moments of indecision, she began to move again, but with extreme caution, each step deliberate and silent. The men followed her, imitating her stealth. After about 100 meters, they reached the edge of a small natural depression. Aurora stopped, looking at them meaningfully before carefully descending to the bottom. What they saw there made them both hold their breath. In the center of the depression, half hidden by snow and fallen branches, was a modern trail camera, of the type used in wildlife research. Next to it, stuck in the ground, a metal stake held what was clearly bait, meat wrapped in a shiny substance that Miguel immediately identified. "Tranquilizer," he whispered with a mix of indignation and concern. "Powerful, judging by the looks of it. And that's not an authorized research camera. Our units have distinctive project markings." Jake examined the device without touching it. "Poachers?" "Worse," Miguel replied, taking out his phone to photograph the find. "Wildlife traffickers. The setup is typical. They drug the animal, capture it alive, and sell it on the black market. A Mexican wolf of this subspecies could fetch astronomical prices among private collectors or illegal zoos." Aurora remained at a distance from the bait, clearly aware of the danger it represented. Her behavior confirmed Miguel's theory. These wolves had had previous encounters with malicious humans, which partially explained their initial distrust. With extreme care, Miguel deactivated the trap and collected both the camera and the bait, storing them in a sealed bag. "This is evidence. We need to alert the authorities immediately." As they returned to the project cabin, Aurora remained unusually close to them, as if understanding that they had neutralized a threat to her family. Occasionally, she would stop to sniff the air or listen to distant sounds, her behavior indicating constant vigilance. Now I understand better why she chose you, Miguel commented as they descended the snowy slope. You're not just an isolated human who doesn't represent a social threat. You're someone who lives in harmony with the mountain, who respects it. She must have perceived that somehow. Jake reflected on that idea. I never saw it that way. I always thought I isolated myself out of weakness, for not being able to face my own failures. But maybe there was something deeper going on. Back at the project cabin, Miguel established satellite communication with the environmental authorities in Denver and with his colleagues in Durango. The news of the attempted illegal hunting of a protected species generated immediate responses. A park ranger patrol would be sent to the area in the coming days, and the project researchers would accelerate their return to reinforce surveillance. This changes things, Miguel explained as he prepared coffee for both of them. The presence of active traffickers means that Aurora and her family are in imminent danger. We can't simply wait for Plata to fully recover. We need a more aggressive action plan. Jake nodded, understanding the seriousness of the situation. What do you propose? Constant surveillance to begin with. Between you and me, we could establish shifts. We should also consider temporarily relocating the family to a safer site, perhaps closer to our cabins, where we can monitor them better. Miguel unfolded a detailed map on the table. There are some smaller caves here and here that could serve as temporary shelter. While discussing strategies, Jake noticed something on one of the weather station monitors. Temperatures were dropping rapidly, and the clouds they had observed for the past few days were beginning to form a characteristic pattern. Miguel, he interrupted, pointing to the screen. I think a serious storm is coming. The biologist checked the data, and his expression turned serious. You're right. The frontal system is intensifying. According to this, we could face up to 2 feet of new snow in the next 48 hours, with extremely low temperatures. The imminent storm greatly complicated the situation. If the wolves were trapped in their current cave during a prolonged storm, with Plata still convalescing and Spot depending on both adults, their chances of survival would decrease considerably. On the other hand, attempting to move them in these conditions also presented significant risks. We must make a decision now, Miguel said, checking his watch. If we want to relocate them, we have to do it before the storm intensifies. Jake considered the options, remembering the territory they had explored with Aurora during the past few days. Suddenly, an idea came to his mind. How about my cabin? Miguel looked at him in surprise. So your cabin? I have an attached shed originally built to store firewood and equipment. It's spacious, solid, protected from the wind, and could be quickly adapted for them. They would be close, we could monitor them constantly, and no traffickers would look for wild wolves next to a human dwelling. The proposal was bold, but it made sense. Miguel nodded slowly. It could work. Aurora already trusts you, and if we can get her to accept the shed as temporary shelter, Plata and Spot would follow her. Without wasting time, they returned to Jake's cabin to prepare the shed. Working against the clock as the first snowflakes began to fall, they cleaned the space, installed blankets to create a comfortable area, and ensured it had enough ventilation while being protected from the frigid drafts. Now comes the hard part, Miguel said when they finished. Convincing Aurora. With backpacks loaded with fresh meat and the necessary medications for Plata and Spot, they set out on their way back to the cave, fighting against the wind that was increasing in intensity. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and visibility was beginning to decrease with the increasingly heavy snowfall. Upon reaching the cave, they found the wolf family huddled together, as if sensing the arrival of the storm. Aurora received them with her usual attention, but Jake noticed a certain unease in her behavior. Faster movements, frequent glances toward the entrance, constantly alert ears. She knows something's wrong, he commented in a low voice. She senses the storm better than we do. Miguel nodded as he prepared an antibiotic injection for Plata. Animals have that sensitivity we've lost. But it also means she'll understand why we're here. After administering the medication and checking Plata's wounds, which showed steady, albeit slow, recovery, Miguel took a harness specially designed for transporting injured wild canids from his backpack. It was lightweight but sturdy, with padding at the pressure points and a system that would allow 2 people to carry Plata without causing him additional pain. We use this in emergency situations, he explained. It's never ideal to move an injured animal, but sometimes it's the only option. Jake looked with concern at the size of the harness and then at Plata. Do you think it will work? He's a large specimen. It should fit well enough, The real challenge will be keeping him calm during the transfer. Miguel looked at Aurora, who was observing the harness with clear suspicion, and for that we need her cooperation. Slowly, Miguel began to speak to Aurora in a low, monotonous voice, explaining what they needed to do, while simultaneously letting her sniff the harness to familiarize herself with it. The wolf alternated her attention between the strange device, the two men, and her vulnerable family. Jake, following an intuition, took out his camera and showed Aurora the photographs he had taken of her and her family during the previous days. It was a symbolic gesture, but somehow he felt it could communicate his intentions better than words. "We want to protect them," he murmured as he scrolled through the images. "Trust us one more time." After what seemed like an eternity, Aurora approached the harness and sniffed it extensively, then looked at Plata and emitted a soft whimper. The older wolf responded with an almost imperceptible movement of his head, as if giving permission. "It's now or never," Miguel said. With infinite care, they placed the harness around Plata's body, adjusting it to distribute the weight without pressing on his wounds. The wolf remained remarkably cooperative, although his eyes revealed some anxiety. Spot watched everything with youthful curiosity, occasionally approaching to sniff the strange apparatus that enveloped his father. "Ready," Miguel finally announced. Now with extreme care, between the two men they lifted Plata, holding the harness at the designated points. The wolf weighed considerably, but the system distributed the load efficiently. Aurora remained by his side at all times, while Spot followed closely, limping slightly but clearly more recovered than days before. The return trip was a test of endurance and determination. The storm had increased in intensity, with gusts of wind that almost knocked them down and snow that hampered visibility. Miguel led the way, using a GPS to maintain the correct direction, while Jake carefully followed his steps, both carrying Plata with as much care as the difficult conditions allowed. Aurora never left her mate's side, guiding Spot and occasionally looking at the men as if checking their progress. Her presence was comforting amidst the increasing whiteness that surrounded them, erasing trails and landmarks. When they finally spotted Jake's cabin through the curtain of snow, a silent sigh of relief escaped both men. The last stretch was perhaps the most difficult, with the snow accumulating rapidly and fatigue taking its toll on their bodies. Upon reaching the shed, they gently deposited Plata on the nest of blankets they had prepared. Aurora entered immediately afterward, inspecting every corner of the space before lying down next to her mate. Spot, exhausted from the journey, collapsed next to both of them, his ragged breathing gradually normalizing. "We did it," Jake murmured, watching the family settle into their temporary shelter. Miguel nodded, his face showing both relief and concern. "Now we must hope that the storm isn't as severe as predicted, and that this change doesn't cause setbacks in Plata's recovery." They left enough water and food in the shed, making sure the door could be opened from the inside in case Aurora decided to go out, although with the storm raging it seemed unlikely she would try anytime soon. A small opening near the ceiling provided adequate ventilation without allowing snow or icy wind to enter. That night, as the storm raged around the cabin, Jake found himself sitting by the window overlooking the shed, occasionally checking with a flashlight to make sure everything was all right. Miguel had decided to stay as well, communicating via satellite with his colleagues to inform them of the situation and receive updates on the park ranger team, which would inevitably delay their arrival due to the weather conditions. "It's extraordinary what you've accomplished," Miguel commented as they shared a simple dinner of hot soup and bread. "Many biologists specializing in wild canids spend decades trying to establish the level of trust you've achieved in days." Jake reflected on it. "I don't think it's my merit. Aurora made the decision to trust. I just was there when she needed me. Maybe that's the key." Miguel smiled. "Being present, available, without expectations. In a world where everyone wants something from these animals, to photograph them, study them, hunt them, you simply offered help without asking for anything in return." A sound from the shed interrupted the conversation. Both men tensed, but upon inspecting with the flashlight, they simply saw Aurora readjusting herself next to Plata, gently grooming her mate's silvery fur. "I think I've never witnessed such a pure expression of devotion," Jake murmured, observing the tender gesture. The storm intensified throughout the night, becoming one of the most intense Jake could remember in his 3 years in the mountains. The wind howled through the trees, shaking the cabin with occasional force, while the snow accumulated rapidly, forming mounds that soon reached the windowsills. Despite the chaos outside, inside the shed the wolf family seemed to find unexpected peace. During his periodic checks, Jake noticed how Spot had huddled between his parents, protected from the cold and the terrifying sounds of the storm. The scene evoked a sense of home that resonated deeply within him. The storm lasted 3 days, longer than any forecast had anticipated. The accumulated snow made any expedition impossible, keeping Jake, Miguel, and the wolf family confined to the small property. What had initially been an emergency measure gradually became a routine. Each morning, Jake and Miguel visited the shed to check on the wolves, provide them with food and fresh water, and change Plata's bandages. The older wolf's recovery progressed remarkably, perhaps aided by the stability and security of his current environment. Aurora began to venture out of the shed occasionally, exploring the immediate surroundings of the cabin, always returning quickly to her family. Spot, with his paw almost completely healed, sometimes accompanied her, his youthful curiosity awakened by this new territory, full of intriguing scents. By the 4th day, when the storm finally subsided, leaving a transformed landscape under a blanket of pristine snow, Jake found himself facing an unexpected reality. He had become deeply attached to these animals. The prospect of eventually returning them to the wild, although correct and necessary, caused him a sense of anticipated loss he hadn't experienced in years. While Miguel made a trip to his cabin to check its condition and retrieve additional equipment, Jake spent hours photographing the wolf family. They weren't simply documentary photographs. Each image attempted to capture the essence of these extraordinary beings: Plata's serene dignity, Aurora's watchful intelligence, Spot's playful vitality. Reviewing the images on his computer, Jake suddenly understood how profoundly he had changed in just a few weeks. The man who had fled life and his own ambitions, who had chosen isolation as a refuge from failure, was being transformed by the connection with these wild beings. "What are you doing, Jake?" he murmured to himself, contemplating a particularly moving image of Aurora with her family. "These aren't your wolves. They're not pets. This isn't your glory to rescue them." An inner voice, the same one that had pushed him into isolation years ago, began to whisper its usual doubts. Who was he to intervene in the natural course of these animals? Wasn't he simply using this situation to feel important again, to redeem himself from his past failures? Miguel's return interrupted his downward spiral of negative thoughts. The biologist brought important news. The park rangers had finally managed to access the region and were investigating the wolf traps. In addition, his project colleagues would return in 2 days, bringing additional equipment and a specialized veterinarian. "I also contacted several colleagues in the city," Miguel added as he unpacked fresh supplies. "I sent them some of your photographs. I hope you don't mind." "They are absolutely impressed with the quality and with what you've managed to capture." Jake felt a knot in his stomach. "My photographs? Who exactly did you send them to?" Miguel seemed to notice his unease. "Only our team and the director of the conservation department at the university. No one will publish them without your permission, if that's what you're worried about." "That's not it," Jake replied, although partially it was. "It's just that these images aren't for exhibition or recognition. They're something personal." "I understand," Miguel nodded, although his expression suggested he didn't fully comprehend. "But Jake, what you've documented here is scientifically invaluable. The interaction between humans and Mexican wolves at this level is unprecedented. Your photographs could change perceptions, influence conservation policies." Miguel's words, though well-intentioned, intensified the internal conflict Jake was experiencing. On the one hand, the idea that his work could significantly contribute to the protection of these extraordinary animals was deeply satisfying. On the other hand, the fear of public recognition, of expectations, of potentially disappointing again, felt paralyzing. "I need time," he finally said, "to think about this." That afternoon, as he watched Aurora guide Spot on a short exploration around the snowy perimeter of the cabin, Jake reflected on the nature of his resistance. It wasn't simply fear of failure that had distanced him from his career. It was fear of connection, of feeling too much, of being vulnerable to loss. His most acclaimed photographs had always captured moments of intense emotion in the natural world: the protective ferocity of a jaguar with her cubs, the delicacy of birds building a nest, the dignity of an old deer facing its last winter. He had documented life in its most authentic and vulnerable expression, and at some point, the weight of witnessing so much beauty and fragility had become unbearable. Aurora's appearance in his life had forced Jake to confront precisely what he had fled: deep connection, the responsibility that comes with being a witness, the inevitability of separation and loss. That night, unable to sleep, Jake reviewed old folders on his computer, images from his most prolific years that he hadn't opened in a long time. Among them, he found a particularly painful sequence: photographs taken in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, where he had documented a family of cougars for months, until the day he found evidence that poachers had killed the mother. That had been the last assignment he completed before gradually abandoning his career. The helplessness he felt then, the anger toward humans and toward himself for being merely an observer, a documentarian unable to protect what he loved, had been the catalyst for his eventual retreat to the mountains. Now, confronted with Aurora and her family, those same feelings resurfaced, but this time accompanied by something new: the possibility of acting, of influencing positively, of protecting. And that, paradoxically, was even more terrifying than helplessness. Talking to ghosts? Miguel's voice startled him. The biologist had woken up and was watching from the doorway of the small room Jake had prepared for him. Something like that, Jake admitted, closing the laptop. Miguel approached, offering him a cup of tea he had just made. "You know, when I started working with endangered species, my mentor gave me some advice I never forgot. Don't obsess over what you might lose. Focus on what you can save today." Jake accepted the cup, appreciating the warmth in his hands. Sounds like a wise man. He was. Miguel smiled nostalgically. He also told me that the greatest enemy of conservation isn't poachers or corrupt politicians, but the hopelessness that paralyzes those who could make a difference. The words resonated deeply in Jake. How did you overcome that? The feeling that it's never enough, that for every animal you save, dozens more are doomed. I didn't overcome it, Miguel confessed simply. I learned to live with it, to use it as fuel instead of letting it consume me. Every day I choose again to believe that what I do matters, even if it's small on a global scale. They remained in contemplative silence for several minutes, the only sound being the crackling of the fire in the stove and the occasional wind rustling the trees outside. Finally, Miguel spoke again. Tomorrow we'll try to get Plata to take his first steps outside the shed. The forecast indicates a clear day with tolerable temperatures. It will be a good indicator of how advanced his recovery is. Jake nodded. I'll be ready. The next morning, as Miguel predicted, dawned with a surprisingly clear sky, the winter sun illuminating the snowy landscape surrounding the cabin. The temperature, although cold, was considerably more tolerable than in previous days. With careful planning, they prepared a cleared area in front of the shed, removing the excess snow and creating a firm path where Plata could walk without risking reopening his wounds. Aurora observed these preparations with evident interest, occasionally assisting in her own way, cleaning areas with her paws that the humans had overlooked. When everything was ready, Miguel approached the shed and, with gentle gestures, invited the wolf family to come out. Spot was the first to venture out, enthusiastically exploring the snowy yard, his fully recovered paw allowing him to jump and play like any healthy pup. Aurora came out next, cautious but confident, immediately turning to encourage Plata. The older wolf remained at the threshold for long minutes, assessing the outside with a watchful gaze. Finally, with deliberately slow but firm movements, he took his first steps outside the shelter. Jake, camera in hand, documented every moment of this small but significant victory. The dignity with which Plata moved, despite the evident residual pain, Aurora's patience walking beside him, naturally adjusting her fast pace to accompany her weakened mate. Spot's energy darting around both, all formed an image of family resilience that transcended species. Extraordinary, Miguel murmured, observing with a clinical eye but also with undeniable emotion. His recovery is progressing better than I expected. The flank wounds are healing cleanly and show no signs of secondary infection. Plata walked to the center of the cleared area, where he stopped to lift his face toward the winter sun, eyes half closed in evident enjoyment of the gentle warmth. Aurora remained vigilant by his side, while Spot alternated between exploring the snowdrifts and returning to check on his parents. For Jake, something crystallized at that moment. Watching this wild family gradually regain their strength and freedom, he understood that his own path to healing was inextricably linked to theirs. His passion for photography had been reborn not as an end in itself, but as a means to something greater, documenting and protecting the vulnerable beauty of the natural world. "I think I'm ready," he said suddenly. Miguel looked at him questioningly. "Ready? To share these photographs, to reconnect with the world, to use what I can do in the service of something bigger than my fear." A broad smile lit up the biologist's face. "I'm glad to hear that." As they continued to watch the wolves enjoy their brief, supervised freedom, Jake felt something loosen inside him, an old knot of anguish beginning to dissolve. The obstacle he had built between himself and his purpose, the fear of feeling too much, of losing what he loved, was beginning to transform into something different. The acceptance that loving something always involves risk, and that risk is precisely what makes it worthwhile. Aurora, as if perceiving it, approached him and briefly pressed her body against Jake's leg before returning to her family. It was a simple but profoundly significant gesture, a recognition between two beings who, each in their own way, were learning to trust again. The sun reached its highest point when a distant but unmistakable sound broke the morning's tranquility. The engine of a vehicle approaching along the winding forest road leading to Jake's property. Plata immediately tensed, his ears turning toward the source of the noise, while Aurora instinctively guided Spot back to the safety of the shed. "It must be the reserve team," Miguel explained, checking his watch. "They arrived earlier than expected." Jake nodded, a mix of expectation and apprehension stirring within him. For more than 3 years, his cabin had been a solitary refuge, with no visitors other than the occasional forest official checking his residency permit. The arrival of an entire team of biologists and park rangers represented an invasion of his carefully cultivated privacy. "I'll go make sure the family is comfortable in the shed," he said, heading toward where the wolves had retreated. "Then I'll catch up with you." Aurora watched Jake with apparent understanding as he checked that they had enough water and ensured Plata's makeshift bed was properly arranged. "They'll be fine," he reassured himself, although the words were as much to reassure himself as the animals. "They're people who want to protect them, like us." When he finally emerged to greet the newcomers, he found his cabin yard occupied by an SUV with the Sierra Sentinels project emblem and an official patrol car from the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Miguel was already engaged in conversation with the group. 2 young biologists who Jake assumed were the previously mentioned colleagues, an older woman with the unmistakable briefcase of a veterinarian, and 2 park rangers in official uniform. "Here's our host," Miguel announced as Jake approached. "Jake Miller, the man who has achieved the impossible with our family of Mexican wolves." The introductions followed quickly. The biologists were Elena Cortez and Javier Mendoza, specialists in animal behavior and genetics, respectively. The veterinarian, Dr. Luisa Ramirez, was a recognized authority on Mexican wildlife. The park rangers, Captain Ernesto Salazar and Officer Teresa Mondragon, belonged to the Special Unit Against Environmental Crimes. "We've been checking the reported traps," Captain Salazar reported after the initial greetings. "We found 3 additional devices within a 3-mile radius. Sophisticated, expensive, definitely not the work of local hunters. We believe we're dealing with an organized wildlife trafficking ring," Officer Mondragon added. "The components match seizures made in previous operations in Arizona and New Mexico." Miguel nodded gravely. "Have you identified any suspects?" "We have some leads," Salazar replied, his expression professionally reserved. "But we'll need several days of undercover surveillance to confirm. Meanwhile, we need to decide what to do with the wolves." Dr. Ramirez then intervened. "May I see the injured male? According to the photographs and Miguel's description, his condition requires immediate professional assessment." Jake exchanged a look with Miguel before replying. "Of course, but I must warn you that they are extremely sensitive to strangers. Perhaps it's better if initially only Miguel or I go in with you." The veterinarian nodded, understanding. "Of course. I'll work according to the terms the animals find most comfortable." While the others unpacked equipment and established a security perimeter around the property, Jake led Dr. Ramirez to the shed, with Miguel following closely behind. As he had predicted, the presence of a stranger caused immediate tension in the wolf family. Aurora positioned herself protectively in front of Plata and Spot, her posture clearly defensive, but not openly aggressive. "Extraordinary," the veterinarian murmured, keeping a respectful distance. "I've never seen this level of family organization in semi-wild Mexican wolves. Their behavior is almost domestic, but without losing their natural instincts. There's nothing domestic about them, Jake corrected gently. They've chosen to trust, which is something completely different. The doctor gave him an evaluating look, as if seeing beyond his words. Of course, poor choice of words on my part. With infinite patience and following Jake's instructions, the veterinarian gradually managed to get close enough to perform a visual examination of Plata. Aurora never completely moved away, but she allowed the approach, her amber eyes fixed on every movement. Impressive first aid work, Ramirez commented after observing the treated wounds. Healing is progressing exceptionally well considering the initial severity. However, I detected possible deep muscle damage that will require more intensive therapy if we want him to regain full mobility. Miguel nodded. What do you recommend? Transferring him to specialized facilities? The question provoked an immediate reaction from Jake. We can't separate them, he said with unexpected firmness. They're a family. Aurora would never abandon Plata, and Spot needs both parents. The veterinarian considered his words carefully. I agree that separation would be traumatic and potentially counterproductive. The family structure is clearly a positive factor in the male's recovery. She paused reflectively. But the facilities here are makeshift at best. We need equipment that can't be easily transported to the field. What if we adapt this space, Jake suggested, his mind suddenly clear and focused. I have tools, building materials. With help, we could turn this shed into a temporary but adequate rehabilitation station. The proposal generated a long technical discussion about veterinary requirements, biological considerations, and practical logistics. To Jake's surprise, his ideas were taken seriously, complemented and refined by the specialists instead of being dismissed as the suggestions of a well-intentioned amateur. During the following hours, while Elena and Javier set up non-invasive monitoring equipment around the shed and the park rangers mapped the property to implement security measures, Jake worked side by side with Miguel and occasionally with Dr. Ramirez, transforming the rustic shed into a space that combined Plata's medical needs with the natural comfort the family required. In the mid-afternoon, exhausted but strangely energized, Jake found himself contemplating the transformation not only of the physical space, but of his own perception. What had begun as an intrusion into his solitude had become something completely different. Genuine collaboration, shared purpose, an impromptu but authentic community, united by the desire to protect something valuable. It's turning out well, Elena commented, approaching with 2 cups of coffee. She offered one to Jake as she observed the modified shed. Miguel says you were a photographer before becoming a hermit. Jake smiled at the frank description. Something like that. I saw some of your images on his phone. They're different. Eleanor seemed to be searching for the right words. Not only technically impressive, but intimate, as if the animals had invited you into their world. That's exactly the point, Jake admitted. I was never interested in simply capturing the appearance of animals, but that fleeting moment when they reveal something of their essence. And now you've captured something no one has documented before. The family dynamics of the last mountain Mexican wolves. Eleanor looked at him directly. Do you know what that means for the conservation of the species? The question hung between them, laden with implications that Jake had been avoiding confronting directly. His photographs, if shared strategically, could transform public perception of these elusive animals, generate support for protection initiatives, and possibly even influence environmental policies. It means responsibility, he finally replied. Eleanor nodded. Exactly. That night, as the team dined in the small cabin room, the conversation inevitably turned to the future. How long would the wolf family remain in rehabilitation? Where would they eventually be released? How would their continued protection be ensured? Ideally, we would relocate them to a more remote area once Plata is fully recovered, Javier explained, further away from any human access, where traffickers would have more difficulty operating, but also further away from any supervision or assistance if they need it again, Jake objected. Dr. Ramirez intervened. The main objective must always be to return them to completely wild life. However special your connection is with them, Jake, these animals belong to nature. The words, though spoken kindly, pierced Jake like a cold dagger of inescapable truth. Of course, they belonged to nature. Of course, the ultimate goal had to be their complete freedom, far from any human dependence, even his. And yet, the prospect of losing the connection he had formed with Aurora and her family was painfully difficult to contemplate. Miguel, sensing his internal conflict, offered a different perspective. There are many ways to maintain a connection, Jake. Your work with them doesn't have to end when they're released. In fact, it could transform into something even more significant. What do you mean? We're considering establishing a new permanent research station, specifically dedicated to the monitoring and protection of this subspecies, Miguel explained. We would need a resident photographer, someone who documents not only for scientific purposes, but also to educate the general public, someone who understands these animals beyond statistical data. The proposal hung in the air like a dazzling possibility. Before Jake could respond, Captain Salazar received a call that immediately tightened the atmosphere. After a brief conversation, the park ranger addressed the group with a serious expression. We have reports of suspicious activity about 2 miles west. An unauthorized vehicle was sighted by our night patrol colleagues. We must reinforce security immediately. The news catalyzed an immediate reorganization. The park rangers would go to investigate, while the biologists and veterinarian would remain at the cabin, implementing additional security protocols. Jake and Miguel would be responsible for maintaining direct surveillance of the Wolf family. "Why do you think it's the traffickers?" Jake asked as they checked that the shed was properly secured. "It's likely," Miguel replied, his voice tense. "Information about Mexican wolves in rehabilitation could have leaked. These creatures would be worth a fortune in certain markets." Strategically positioned to observe any unauthorized approach, Jake and Miguel stood guard in shifts throughout the night. In the quiet of their vigil, contemplating the bright stars over the snow-capped mountains, Jake found a clarity that had eluded him for years. His isolation, which had begun as an escape, could transform into purpose. His talent with the camera, which he had abandoned for fear of the emotional connection it implied, could become a conservation tool. His relationship with Aurora and her family, initially a chance encounter, could evolve into a lifelong commitment. As dawn began to color the horizon, Jake had made his decision. He didn't know exactly how future events would unfold, but he had absolute clarity about his role in them. He would be a witness, documentarian, and protector of these extraordinary beings who had shown him the way back to his own humanity. Aurora, perhaps sensing the change in his spirit, briefly emerged from the shed at the first ray of sun, her silhouette cut against the golden light. Her eyes met Jake's across the distance, conveying that unique understanding that transcended species. It wasn't words they shared, but something deeper, mutual recognition of beings who had found their way back to life through each other. The following weeks unfolded at an intense yet harmonious pace. Jake's cabin, formerly a refuge of isolation, had become the nerve center of a multifaceted conservation operation. The shed, now adequately equipped, functioned as a rehabilitation station where Plata continued his recovery under the rotating supervision of Dr. Ramirez and the project biologists. Simultaneously, the park rangers had established a surveillance perimeter, extending several miles in all directions, constantly monitoring any suspicious activity. The presence of wildlife traffickers had been confirmed when they found a hastily abandoned camp, with sophisticated capture equipment and documents suggesting connections to international networks. For Jake, these days represented a strange but satisfying combination of his former isolation and a new connection with shared purpose. He still had ample moments of solitude, especially during his photographic expeditions in the surrounding area, but now there was a context of community that he found surprisingly comforting. His relationship with the Wolf family continued to deepen in unexpected ways. Aurora had begun to include him in family rituals, such as feeding Spot or the group grooming at sunset. Plata, initially the most reserved, now accepted his presence with quiet dignity, occasionally even allowing brief physical contact during medical checkups. "I've never seen anything like it," Dr. Ramirez commented one afternoon, watching Jake participate in a physical therapy session with Plata. "It's as if they've developed their own language." "It's not really a language," Jake replied, as he gently guided the silvery wolf through exercises designed to strengthen his damaged muscles. "It's more like attunement. We pay attention to each other." Plata's progress exceeded all medical expectations. What had initially been projected as a 6-month rehabilitation showed remarkable results in just 6 weeks. His mobility improved daily, and although he maintained a slight limp that would likely be permanent, he had regained enough strength and stamina to begin supervised excursions of increasingly longer distances. Spot, meanwhile, had grown remarkably. his youthful fur beginning to show the first signs of the silver that would characterize his adulthood. His playful and curious personality made him a favorite of the team, although Jake always maintained a careful balance to prevent the pup from developing excessive dependence on humans. One particularly clear morning, while Jake was photographing the family during their morning walk, Miguel approached with important news. "The park rangers intercepted 2 suspects last night," he reported, his expression mixing satisfaction and concern. "Professional traffickers with connections to a buyer in Europe. They had specific information about our wolf family." Jake lowered his camera, suddenly tense. "How did they get that information?" "That's what's worrying," Miguel replied, lowering his voice even though they were alone. "Some details suggest an inside leak. Someone connected to the project or the authorities could be involved." The news fell like lead in Jake's stomach. The idea that someone from the conservation circle could betray these animals was more disturbing than the threat of strangers. "What's next?" "Captain Salazar is intensifying the investigation, but in the meantime, we must accelerate our plans." Miguel took a map from his pocket and unfolded it on a fallen log. "We've identified 3 possible locations for the family's final release. All offer suitable territory, sufficient prey, and minimal human contact." Jake studied the marked locations, all considerably more remote than the current area. "When?" "As soon as Dr. Ramirez authorizes Plata's transfer, maybe 2 weeks if he maintains this recovery pace." 2 weeks. The imminence of separation hit Jake with unexpected force, even though he had always known this moment would eventually come. His gaze instinctively sought Aurora, who was watching Spot chasing winter butterflies among the snowy bushes. "It's not a final goodbye," Miguel added, sensing his conflict. "The research station I mentioned will be established near the release site. As the project's documentary photographer, you'd have regular access for non-invasive monitoring." Jake nodded, grateful for the understanding, but still processing conflicting emotions. The genuine joy at the imminent freedom of these extraordinary animals intertwined with the anticipated sadness of losing the daily intimacy they had developed. "It's the right thing," he finally said, both to Miguel and to himself. "It's always been the goal." The following days took on a bittersweet intensity. Jake intensified his photographic documentation, capturing every aspect of the wolves' family life, every nuance of their personalities, every achievement in Plata's recovery. Simultaneously, the team meticulously prepared the logistics for the transfer and release, from updated tracking equipment to the planning of routes that would minimize stress for the animals. The concern about the possible information leak added an element of constant tension. The park rangers implemented new security protocols, including coded communications and alternative routes that would only be revealed at the last moment. Everyone involved underwent discreet background checks, generating occasional moments of discomfort among the team. One afternoon, while Jake was reviewing images on his computer, Elena rushed into the cabin, her face lit up with excitement. "Jake, Javier has discovered something extraordinary in the genetic samples." The detailed analysis of the wolf family's DNA had revealed something unexpected. Aurora and Plata didn't simply belong to a rare subspecies of Mexican wolf. They possibly represented a distinct genetic line believed extinct for decades. Their unique adaptations for high mountain life constituted a significant evolutionary variation previously documented only in historical museum specimens. "This changes everything," Elena explained as the biologists gathered to discuss the implications. "We are not simply protecting a family of an endangered species. We're preserving a genetic variant that could be crucial for the future resilience of the entire Mexican wolf population." Dr. Ramirez, reviewing the results, added another perspective. "The adaptive characteristics they exhibit, thicker fur, compact body structure, increased lung capacity for high altitudes, could be precisely what the species needs to survive in a context of accelerated climate change." The discovery intensified both the importance of the mission and the risks involved. If international traffickers obtained this information, the value of Aurora, Plata, and especially Spot on the black market would multiply exponentially. That night, as a light storm lashed the mountain, Jake remained in the shed with the wolf family longer than usual. Sitting silently in a corner, he watched Aurora meticulously groom Spot, while Plata rested with watchful dignity. "They were always special," he murmured to himself. They were always important beyond what we could understand. As if responding to his thoughts, Aurora looked up and observed him with those amber eyes that seemed to contain ancestral wisdom. It wasn't anthropomorphism that Jake saw there, but genuine interspecies recognition that had shared something profound and transformative. The release plan was finalized the next morning in a restricted meeting that included only Miguel, the park rangers, Dr. Ramirez, and Jake. The chosen location was a remote valley in the Eastern Range, accessible only by helicopter or a strenuous 3-day horseback expedition. The area had abundant prey, permanent water, and virtually no human presence. "We'll leave the day after tomorrow at dawn," Captain Salazar concluded. "Only this group will know the exact route until the moment of departure. Any communication related to the operation will be strictly verbal, without digital records." Jake spent the following day preparing his photographic equipment and packing essentials for the expedition. It was a practical task that allowed him to keep his emotions at bay, focusing on technical aspects instead of the imminent separation. Occasionally, he would stop to visit the Wolf family, bringing special treats approved by the veterinarian and simply existing in their presence, absorbing these last moments of proximity. Aurora seemed to sense the impending change. Her behavior showed a subtle unease, alternating between periods of intense family grooming and moments where she simply observed Jake with sustained attention, as if memorizing his presence. That night, the second to last before the departure, Jake was awakened by a subtle but unmistakable sound, Aurora's soft, melancholic howl, not from the shed, but from somewhere closer to the cabin. Rising silently so as not to wake Miguel, who was sleeping in the adjoining room, Jake approached the window. Under the silvery moonlight, Aurora was sitting in the center of the snowy yard, her elegant silhouette cut against the brilliance of the winter landscape. Her howl wasn't a territorial call or a communication with other wolves. It was something more intimate, almost like a personal song directed toward the cabin, toward him. Jake went out silently, wrapping himself in the first jacket he found. The night cold was intense but bearable, the absolute quiet except for that wolfish song that now softened as he appeared. He sat on the porch steps, without approaching further, respecting the space Aurora had chosen. For long minutes they remained like that, in silent communion under the bright stars. Words or gestures were unnecessary. It was a moment of mutual recognition, of honoring what they had shared and what they now had to separate. Eventually, Aurora gracefully rose and approached until she was barely 3 feet away. Her eyes, reflecting the moonlight, contained an intensity that Jake would never forget. Then, with surprising delicacy, the wolf briefly rubbed her body against Jake's leg, before decisively walking away toward the shed where her family awaited. Jake remained motionless, silent tears tracing cold paths on his cheeks. That simple touch had conveyed more than any possible words: gratitude, connection, and a farewell in Aurora's own terms. Dawn brought with it the final preparations for the expedition. Off-road vehicles waited loaded with specialized equipment. The wolves would be transported in transport cages, specifically designed to minimize stress, with removable partitions that would allow continuous visual and olfactory contact between family members. Dr. Ramirez personally supervised the light sedation administered to the 3 wolves, just enough to facilitate the initial transfer without compromising their vital functions. Jake remained present throughout the process, his calm voice offering continuous reassurance as the animals gradually succumbed to the effect of the tranquilizers. "They'll be fine," the veterinarian assured as she checked Aurora's vital signs. "The dose is perfectly calculated for their weight and metabolism. They will gradually wake up during the journey, fully alert by the time we reach the release site." The journey east proceeded with military precision. The caravan, consisting of 2 main vehicles and a park ranger escort, maintained minimal communication and followed sparsely traveled secondary routes. Miguel and Jake traveled in the main vehicle with the cages, constantly monitoring the wolves who were gradually regaining consciousness. Aurora was the first to wake up completely, her initially disoriented gaze quickly clearing as she located her family and Jake. She showed no signs of panic or attempted to free herself. She maintained a watchful calm that suggested understanding of the temporary situation. At noon, after changing to complementary vehicles at a previously coordinated point, the expedition left formal roads to venture into barely visible forest trails, proceeding slowly through increasingly rugged terrain. By mid-afternoon, they had reached the furthest point accessible by vehicle. "We'll continue on foot from here," Captain Salazar announced. "The target valley is about 3 miles in that direction after crossing that mountain pass." The last leg of the journey was physically demanding. The wolves, now fully awake but maintaining surprising calm, were transported in their cages by relays of experienced park rangers. Jake insisted on being part of these relays, particularly for Aurora's cage, who maintained almost constant eye contact with him. When they finally reached the designated release point, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, bathing the valley in golden light. It was a place of breathtaking wild beauty, alpine meadows protected by steep, rocky peaks, a crystalline stream meandering through lush vegetation, and clear evidence of abundant wildlife in the form of tracks and natural trails. "It's perfect," Jake murmured, absorbing the majesty of the surroundings. "Truly perfect." Miguel nodded, equally impressed. "Protected area, extremely limited human access, abundant prey, multiple natural shelter options. If there's a paradise for mountain Mexican wolves, it's this one." The release was planned with meticulous attention to detail. The cages were positioned in a relatively open area that would allow the wolves to assess their new territory before venturing further. They would first release Plata, then Spot, and finally Aurora, following the recommended protocol that would allow the alpha male to establish initial security. Jake, camera in hand but discreetly positioned, would document the moment without interfering. The other team members would maintain a respectful distance, observing through binoculars and augmented vision equipment. With the setting sun illuminating the scene in golden and coppery tones, the moment arrived. Dr. Ramirez checked the vital signs of each wolf one last time, confirming their excellent condition to face their new wildlife. "They're ready," she finally announced, looking at Jake with empathetic understanding. "It's time." Miguel approached Jake as the park rangers prepared to open the cages sequentially. "Do you want to do it?" he asked softly, offering him the honor of the last act of connection. Jake considered briefly, then shook his head. "It should be natural without my direct intervention. They should choose their freedom, not receive it from my hands." The opening of Plata's cage created a moment of absolute suspension. The silvery wolf remained motionless for long seconds, cautiously assessing the unfamiliar surroundings. Finally, with majestic dignity, he slowly emerged, his limp barely perceptible as he moved a few meters before stopping to sniff the mountain air intensely. Spot was released next. Unlike his father's caution, the young wolf enthusiastically leaped into freedom, although he maintained a prudent exploration distance before returning to the proximity of Plata, who received him with brief, reassuring grooming. Finally, it was Aurora's turn. The park rangers opened her cage and quickly stepped back, leaving the path completely free. The wolf emerged with contained grace, immediately rejoining her family. The three remained together for several minutes, apparently communicating through subtle body movements and brief contacts. Then Aurora did something unexpected. Momentarily separating herself from Plata and Spot, she turned to look directly toward where Jake remained partially hidden behind a rocky outcrop. With infallible precision, her amber eyes met his across the distance. Jake lowered his camera, allowing this last exchange without technological intermediaries. For an eternal moment, man and wolf maintained eye contact that transcended words and species. It was pure recognition, mutual gratitude, and finally, liberation. Aurora emitted a brief howl, not of sadness, but of celebration, before returning to her family. With Plata leading and Spot energetically jumping between both parents, the wolf family began their advance into the depths of the valley toward their new beginning. Jake watched them walk away, his heart simultaneously full and aching. When they finally disappeared into the distant vegetation, he slowly exhaled, releasing emotions contained for weeks. "They're free," he murmured, both to himself and to Miguel, who remained silently by his side. "And so are you," the biologist replied softly. Jake nodded, understanding the profound truth in those simple words. A year later, Jake carefully unloaded photographic equipment from his truck, now emblazoned with the Sierra Sentinels project logo. The promised permanent research station had materialized a few miles from the valley where Aurora and her family had been released, a modest but functional complex of sustainable structures designed for minimal environmental impact. The path since that day of release had been both literal and metaphorical for Jake. After briefly returning to his original cabin to collect essential belongings, he had formally accepted the position of resident documentary photographer for the project. His work over the past months combined meticulous visual tracking of the wolf family with broader expeditions to document other endangered species in the mountain ecosystem. "Any sign of them this week?" Elena asked, emerging from the main station to help him with the equipment. Now a permanent part of the scientific team, the young biologist had developed a close friendship with Jake, united by their shared commitment to conservation. "Nothing direct," Jake replied, "but I found fresh tracks in the northern sector, near the mainstream, and some traces of a successful hunt deer, probably. They're gradually expanding their territory. Data from the subcutaneous trackers indicated that the family was in excellent health and had established a large territory centered on the original valley, but gradually extending into adjacent areas. Plata had remarkably regained his strength, although the slight limp remained as a perpetual reminder of his ordeal. Aurora continued to be the strategic heart of the family unit, while Spot matured into adulthood with increasingly silvery fur. Most extraordinary, revealed during cautious long-distance tracking, was that Aurora had given birth to a new litter 3 months ago, 2 healthy pups representing renewed hope for this unique genetic line. The discovery had generated celebration in the scientific community and reinforced funding for the conservation project. "Miguel called this morning," Elena mentioned as they entered the station. "The exhibition in Denver has been a resounding success. They're extending the exhibition for 2 more weeks due to public demand." Jake smiled, genuinely pleased, but also slightly uncomfortable with the renewed attention on his work. Lone Wolf, Portraits of Wild Trust, had been his official return to the world of professional photography, a carefully curated collection of images documenting the extraordinary relationship with Aurora and her family, complemented by more recent photographs showing their successful adaptation to complete freedom. The exhibition had generated not only artistic recognition, but more importantly for Jake, significant public awareness of the precarious situation of the Mexican wolf and its subspecies. Substantial donations had flowed to conservation initiatives, and lawmakers were beginning to consider additional protections for critical habitats. He also mentioned that the book is almost ready for printing, Elena continued. Publishing houses are competing for international rights. The book, combining Jake's photographs with scientific texts from Miguel and his team, represented a bridge between art and science that was generating global interest. To Jake's surprise, he had discovered that sharing these images and this story didn't diminish the intimacy of his experience. Somehow, it amplified it, allowing Aurora and her family to touch many more lives than he had ever imagined. That night, after processing and cataloging the photographs from his recent expedition, Jake walked alone to a small natural viewpoint near the station. The full moon illuminated the mountain landscape with almost daylight clarity, revealing the wild majesty that he now considered home. Sitting in contemplative silence, he reflected on the transformation of his life. The man who had fled into isolation, fearing emotional connection and the inevitable pain it entailed, had found a new balance. Intimacy with the natural world that didn't demand possession, professional purpose that nourished instead of depleting, and human community based on shared values and mutual respect. A distant sound interrupted his thoughts, the unmistakable howl of wolves communicating across the night valley. They were multiple voices intertwined, Plata's deep gravity, Aurora's distinctive tone, Spot's more youthful notes, and now the high-pitched voices of the new generation joining the ancestral family song. Jake closed his eyes, allowing himself to fully absorb the sound. He didn't need to see them to know that they were thriving, that they had found their place in this wild landscape just as he had found his. Almost reflexively, his hands formed the invisible photographic frame that had been his characteristic professional gesture for decades. But this time, he didn't regret the absence of his camera. Some moments didn't need to be visually captured to be perfectly preserved. When the howling finally faded into the night, Jake remained motionless, his heart overflowing with an emotion he had feared for years, but now embraced fully. Gratitude for the privilege of having been briefly a part of something wild and perfect, something that would continue long after he himself became a memory. "Thank you, Aurora," he whispered to the silent mountains. The night wind seemed to respond, carrying with it the scent of pines and freedom. Somewhere in that moonlit valley, A family of unique wolves in the world continued their ancient life cycle, protected in part by a man who had rediscovered his own purpose by helping them find theirs. Jake Miller, formerly a reclusive photographer, now a guardian and visual chronicler of the mountains, smiled toward the starry sky. The path from that first encounter in the snow to this moment had been unexpected at every turn, painful at times, but undeniably beautiful in its entirety. Some connections, he had learned, transcend words, species, and time, and it is precisely these connections that ultimately save us all. My friends, we've reached the end of the story. Did you like it? What lesson can you take from this story? Leave it here in the comments. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and watch this video playing on your screen. This story will impact you. Until next time.